I'm Ian White. I'm the founder and CEO of ChartHop. We're a people operations platform that connects and visualizes all of your people data to empower your organization with insights, alignment, and action. And what we do with a lot of organizations, we help them with organizing compensation data, because that is definitely one of the hardest problems to solve for. And I think everybody in this space, compensation is at an inflection point. A lot of things have changed with how we think about compensation in the last few years. Between the pandemic, driving this whole set of conversations around remote work and remote pay, to pay transparency laws that are transforming our understanding of how we message and communicate compensation, to generational changes and different expectations of how a new generation of workers thinks about compensation and thinks about their relationship to their employer. All of these things has made the comp space drastically different than it was even just a few years ago. So we've got here today three expert people leaders who have all delved deep in the space of compensation planning for each of their organizations. And so we're going to talk about today compensation planning, bringing a data-driven lens to compensation planning, and really all the aspects of the ways that you've leveraged data at your organization. So I'm going to give each panelist a chance to introduce themselves, and I'll start with Crystal.
Hi, hello, my name is Crystal Shields. I am Senior Director of People Operations and Talent Management at Harness, which is a software delivery platform, and we're based out of the San Francisco Bay Area.
I'm Chelsea. I head up total rewards for a company called Jumio, an identity verification software platform, also out of the Bay Area. However, I am remote in Colorado.
Hey everyone, my name is Jonah Harold, and I lead analytics and compensation at Anduril, which is a defense technology company based out of Orange County, California.
Awesome. So I'm going to get started with taking a step back and thinking about the overall landscape of compensation planning. What would you say have been the biggest changes for your organization in the last few years? And I'm going to start with Chelsea.
Yeah, Ian, I think you hit it on the head. It's not necessarily compensation as a whole that's changed. It's the demographics of the workforce and the expectations of the different generations that are moving in and taking over the workforce as some older generations move out. And also the availability of data, being prevalent and easy to find. Compensation data is everywhere. And so comp itself might not have necessarily changed, but the expectations have changed over the past several years.
Yeah, I think the emergence of pay transparency initiatives and legislation have really created this new environment that necessitates that organizations not only establish a well-defined compensation philosophy, but that they also equip stakeholders with the necessary tools to make equitable and consistent compensation decisions. And when we think about traditional comp planning, the image that comes to my mind is of this clunky, super ugly Excel file that's titled something like Software Comp Planning V26 Final Master Final, right? And in a world of advanced technology where we have self-landing rockets, unbelievably proficient algorithms, and these seemingly omnipotent AI chatbots, the Excel file with 37 finals appended onto the end seems to be a little bit outdated. And I think that today's decision makers expect a higher level of sophistication when it comes to something as important as comp planning. And there's an appetite for advanced analytics, automated data pipelines, and perhaps most importantly, for an elegant interface that enables users to process information quickly and coherently. And I think that it's our responsibility to ensure that our organizations are keeping up with the changing landscape. And by embracing new technologies and methods, we can empower our stakeholders to make informed compensation decisions, which will ultimately help drive the success of our organizations.
Yeah, I think, total rewards and compensation has really always been sort of a back office function, and no one really thought about it. Everyone sort of just took the compensation changes and the pay increases that they were given. And with all of these changes in these laws, it's really at the forefront. Social media conversations, people, posting TikToks about what they make, or, I interviewed for the job at my company, and it was for more compensation. And so there's a lot more conversations around that and around pay equity. And so I know when I started at Harness, what was really interesting is day one, they were like, we need a pay structure, right? And that was 4 years ago. And you used to not really have that request made to you as a compensation professional for several years. It wasn't top of mind. And now it's sort of one of the earlier things that you really put in place and programs that you put in place when you start working at a company.
Yeah, I'll add to it. I think the way that I think about my role as a compensation professional is less program builder and more educator. So with the exposure of compensation programs and pay transparency to a broader set of employee populations, it's incredibly important that we empower employees with education, with comp education, that some of us tend to have taken for granted because we've been doing it for years. And we have to remember that employees aren't in that same position. And so that's kind of a different lens on how I view my role as a comp professional now.
Yeah, I think that's all right on. The changing expectations are really a big thing. So when you think about these changes and how they've impacted your organization in particular, what are the biggest things that come to mind?
Well, we started out with kind of a simple pay structure, and now it's gotten to be much more sophisticated. So we had about 120 employees when I started. Now we're about 775. And we're global, right? Many companies are going global so much sooner. So that adds a level of complexity, right, in terms of compensation and setting expectations and people's value about their compensation. So that's become really complex. Also, I work at a startup, right? So I've been there 4 years. Excuse me. I feel like I'm practically a founder, right? Most people don't stick around that long. So you have all of these managers that are sort of cycling through, and they have their own values around compensation, what they did at their last company. And you're trying to manage that while still figuring out what the compensation philosophy is for your company, right? And that is evolving as the company grows and evolves and changes. So it's really constantly changing. You need to be able to flex. But as Chelsea was saying, you also need to be able to educate people. And that part is going to be really tricky because I do think there is a lot of fear on behalf of leadership and on managers to have those difficult conversations when someone says, hey, I found this comp data on salary.com and I think I'm not making enough money. How do you have that conversation in a way that is meaningful to them and feels fair?
I'll add to that just a little bit. Again, the buzzword of transparency and getting ahead of those conversations, helping managers, especially educating managers, because they're the ones at the forefront of those conversations, getting those difficult questions. Talking tracks have been big for us, actually developing out and having back and forth mock-up conversations that managers might actually face on a day-to-day basis or especially during compensation cycles. That has been incredibly powerful for our managers.
Yeah, so at Anduril, we've seen exponential growth over the last couple of years, and we've transitioned from a small defense tech startup to a global company with over 1,500 employees. And for startups, bureaucracy is the enemy, and undue structure is often counterproductive or even toxic. But as Anduril has continued to evolve throughout its life cycle, we really began to recognize the need for some structure. So we underwent a company-wide initiative to create a global compensation architecture and career leveling framework. And we did it so it tied to each role so that we could introduce new metrics that would enable us to better understand compensation data at both a macro level and on an individual basis. And once we had the requisite data to inform compensation decisions, we expanded our pool of decision makers from only a select handful of functional leaders at the company to all managers. And as we rolled all this out and kind of went from zero to hero, we wanted to make sure that we were using structure as a guardrail rather than as a driver. And it was important that we maintain the flexibility to account for each individual's unique circumstance. And an outcome that we really wanted to avoid was managers going back to their teams and saying something like, hey, Sarah, you met expectations this year, so you get a 4% raise. Wish I could do more, but Jonah won't let me, sorry. Rather than blaming the system and company policies, we wanted managers to be accountable for their decisions. So we built context with data and allowed them the autonomy to manage their cash and equity budgets and make the trade-offs that made the most sense for their teams. And as part of this theme of transparency and accountability, we gave employees full visibility into their compensation bands and where they fell, which provided a forcing function for managers to articulate why they made the decisions that they did.
And how does data play a role in all of this?
Yeah, I think when we talk about compensation, people in general are fairly reasonable. And what they really care about is that they're being paid fairly for their contributions. And to ensure that you're doing that, you really can't rely on intuition or vague anecdotes from a friend of a friend, right? The conversation really needs to start and end with data. So for us, comp planning is really built upon the backbone of our compensation structures, which are derived from verified market data. But because we recognize there can be a ton of variance within a role, we don't want to become over-prescriptive or formulaic, and instead we want to use the market data to establish guidelines and to ensure that compensation is being aligned with performance. And we do that by thinking about comp in relation to target values. So, for example, if we have ranges plus or minus 20% of the midpoint, then an employee who's in a stretch role with little to no experience could expect to be comped in the first quartile at 80 to 90% of the midpoint. And as they become qualified for the role and become more proficient, you'd move them closer to or slightly above the midpoint. And then as they develop an expertise in the role, you'd move them into the fourth quartile at 110 to 120% of the midpoint. And using this framework really takes the guesswork out of compensation, and it allows us to easily make recommendations, spot macro trends, identify outliers, and probably most importantly, it allows us to look apples to apples across the organization.
The use of data in that way, so I'll echo what Jonah said, that is, sort of your ideal situation. For those of us, I'll speak frankly for Jumio, the first year of implementing salary structures doesn't always look that beautiful, where your employees land in those salary bands as you would expect them or hope them to they would land. And so without a huge cash infusion, which I don't know that any of us are, flush with cash right now, it takes a while, and it takes that communication and that education piece. And I'll probably harp on education a little bit more today before our time's up, but it takes that education piece because you can't forego rolling out a critical guideline or critical structure for the sake of not being, not having the conversation with employees about, sorry, you're at the lower end of the midpoint. Or lower end of the salary band, but here's kind of a plan of action over the next, 2, 3, 4 compensation cycles. Here's where we're at today. It's about that open-ended, transparent communication, and again, most importantly, the correct education so that employees go along on that journey with you.
Yeah, I always like to say that compensation is a mixture of voodoo and fairy dust. It is. You get your market data, you get data from your recruiters, right? So they're gathering data. You get data from employees who are leaving the company, and you're pulling all of this together. But at the end of the day, it really is about how your company values that job and that role, and then what you can afford to pay. Right? So you've got to balance all of that out. And I find that, while we may have all of the data, from my experience as more of an HR professional, is really having those conversations with the managers, listening to them. Why do you think this is the right compensation for this role? Are you afraid to have that conversation with your employee because you're afraid that they're going to leave? And I firmly believe that if your employee value proposition is so weak that the only way to retain your employee is by paying them more, you've got much bigger problems, right? Compensation is not your only problem or not your biggest problem. So it's really about listening. It is about that transparency. It is about that education. But sometimes you have to compromise a little bit, right? because you don't want to be a penny wise and a pound foolish and lose somebody over $2,500. Like, that just doesn't make any sense. So pulling all of that together, but then also what you know about your people and their values is really important.
Yeah, data is great, but it's all about the context of that data and the communication of that data that's really critical. So when you think about what are some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered rolling out comp planning for your organization? And I'll start with Crystal.
Yeah, again, having these changing managers. So every comp cycle that we go through, there are new managers there, and this is what I did in my last company, and why are we doing it this way? And this doesn't make any sense, and I value the role at this level. So being able to manage that, but also at the end of the day, it's about our CEO, right? What his philosophy is, and our CFO, what our budget is. So, managing all of those pieces together. The other part that's been really important for us from the very, very beginning has been pay equity. And so we've always taken a look at our compensation to make sure that women and people of color and underrepresented groups are paid fairly. And we do that every year because that's always top of mind, right? People always think, I'm not getting paid enough. Right, and they worry about that. And then in this era of high inflation and uncertainty and layoffs, people are even more scared and more worried about their compensation. So again, always just really approaching it from a people standpoint, but also trying to make sure that we're managing the company's resources appropriately, we're paying people fairly. Exceptions are the devil to me, but they happen, right? So trying to keep those exceptions down for folks so that everybody is really getting paid for the work that they're providing to the company.
I think a challenge that we actually faced just because of the incredibly different landscape or economic landscape that we're in today versus where we were at last year as a company is taking a step back and reevaluating our compensation philosophy. So comp philosophy is targeting 65th, 75th percentiles, for the whole company or even just for some targeted roles, proved to not necessarily be sustainable when it came to headcount reductions. And so we were given a unique opportunity to go back and reevaluate that and our overall sustainability of our compensation philosophy. So that's been a little bit of a challenge. It's not necessarily easy to roll out or to get close to rolling out a compensation philosophy and pulling it back. But again, I think just fortuitous of where we're at today, it worked out in our favor, and it really helped our executive team and our board of directors to see the value in a sustainable compensation philosophy, not a marketable or not a really marketable compensation philosophy where 65th, 75th sounds good to people and candidates, but in the end, it really is that 50th percentile and some more conservative compensation philosophies that keep you through hard economic times.
Yeah, so for us, as we rolled out compensation data to 300 managers at once, something that was critical was for us to get permissioning right. And we had some really unique needs that we couldn't address with out-of-the-box solutions. And even if we could, manually managing permissions at scale seemed to be extremely painful. So we wanted to build a custom permissions framework and then automatically add users to a relevant security group based on some set of logic. And luckily for us, ChartHop's API was super flexible, and we were able to use it to build out our custom permissions framework. We were able to do that at a field and employee level of detail. And once we had that, we were able to build a Python function that read employee details from a variety of data sources so that we could determine what permissions group was right for that employee and then programmatically assign them to it in ChartHop. So obviously that was a pretty big technical challenge to automate permissions end to end. But as we rolled everything out, I think the non-technical challenges were just as, if not more difficult. And we really had to overcome the learning curve of managers who had previously never interacted with compensation data before as they suddenly became responsible for making decisions on it. And that really required us to effectively communicate how they should approach those decisions and just why we were making these widespread org changes. And that required us to just communicate in all forums. We traveled to every office and gave formal presentations. We hosted office hours. We wrote documentation and so on, because embedding change in an organization is hard, and it requires a lot of effort and clarity in your communications.
I'd like to add just one more thing. Another challenge was the war for talent, right? Which we're seeing sort of reverse itself, and so many companies have overhired. But when you go out and you say, I'm going to hire a software engineer for X number of dollars, but they can get $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 more at another company, it can really, if you're not careful, it can really throw off your bands and the way that you compensate people, because you just have to have that person, right? So having those conversations with managers, why does it have to be this person? Why do we have to pay this amount of money, right? Is this really the right decision to make? Because sometimes those people aren't a good fit, and now you've made a poor investment, right? Because you're so anxious and you're so pressed to get the right people in to be able to, build your product and move your company forward. So it'll be interesting to see how that will change in terms of our recruiting practices and our retention efforts now that things have sort of changed and people are a little more scared to leave their companies.
Yeah, and the war for talent is still real. I mean, it's a different environment, but you're still going to have those really emotional, heightened conversations with a manager who just wants to close the candidate at $40K outside of the band. Like that still happens. So yeah, very, very real.
If I may, too, for those of you that are HR, maybe not, embedded in comp in your daily roles too, there is not one right answer for what a job is worth. The answer for what a job is worth is different from one company to the next. Your employees, candidates, they will always be able to find that same job worth more money somewhere else, the same way that they'll always be able to find that job worth less money at a different organization. So staying true to your compensation philosophy at your organization, that's key. Develop one, be consistent across the board, stand by it, and educate on it. That's key.
Yeah, and that's where making sure every manager really understands the philosophy, right? So they can go behind it. So there's some great questions from the audience. I want to do one more round for the panelists, which is, in your most recent comp cycle, any best practices that you can share for the group? And I'll start with Chelsea.
Yeah, absolutely. So data integrity, I will take an opportunity to, give a nod to ChartHop. The antiquated Excel sheets, the lack of data integrity that immediately place a stigma on and cause your leadership to question your data integrity as a whole HR department is huge, and it's a big problem to overcome, especially when you launch spreadsheets and immediately you get 50 emails back saying this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. It sets the wrong tone, and so. Having a system that houses accurate people data that is easily accessible across your whole organization, and especially amongst your manager groups, was key for us in launching our compensation cycle smoothly and effectively.
Yeah, to kind of echo what Chelsea said, using ChartHop to build a clean user interface that served as the single dynamic hub for all things comp planning really helped eliminate the operational burden that's so often associated with a comp cycle, and it allowed us to kind of just set it and forget it. Also, by using market data and comp ratios, we enabled managers to make data-driven decisions, which really added substance and context to comp conversations without all the emotions that typically come along with them. Also, by adopting these really wide ranges, we were able to move employees throughout the band without having to perpetuate this unsustainable model where we need to promote our high performers annually in order to give them a meaningful increase. And then lastly, I think that by socializing a concise set of easily digestible metrics, we were able to establish a standardized framework for how we think about comp. And that really helped improve understanding throughout the organization because we were all aligned and we were all calibrating against the same reference point.
Yeah, and I'll join the ChartHop bandwagon. So, I used to do the big crazy Google sheet and trying to cut that for all of our executives, and it just wasn't sustainable. When we were much smaller, it was fine, it wasn't great, but as we reached the 300-person mark, it wasn't sustainable. And so when we found ChartHop, I was like, great, I can put this in there. We can look at all the compensation, have all the compensation history that I've painstakingly made sure that my team pulled together, which is really important because, again, as the managers change, you want to be able to have that conversation is why did that person have that compensation journey? You're a new manager. You're not going to know that. Empowering managers to manage their compensation. So when we were using a Google sheet, I could only send it to an executive, right? Because I just couldn't cut that many sheets and send it out to so many people. So that empowerment for managers, it helps them gain that confidence to be able to manage the compensation and have the conversations in a confident, clear, fair way.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I mean, I've lived the V5 of the spreadsheet, and the worst thing is when that actually gets shared with the wrong people in the organization, which is also fun. But yeah, a self-serve platform does help a lot.
We didn't rehearse that, by the way, either. But one of the questions up here is what platforms or tools are you leveraging? And the answer for all of us here, is ChartHop. It houses our people data. It keeps it up to date, real time, and it feels very familiar to managers because it is somewhat sheet oriented, but with all of the bells and whistles and customizable formulas and fields that you can put in. So it feels very, it still feels very familiar, and there's a level of comfort there, in my personal opinion, that goes with that user interface that managers have really appreciated.
That's awesome. There's so many great questions from the audience. Let's talk about exec comp and equity refreshes. It feels very challenging right now, given the market environment and size of recent rounds. Anyone have any thoughts on exec comp and equity?
I'll go. I'll take it. So board of directors and comp committee should really drive this. It really depends on what stage of the what stage your organization is in, what's important to that organization. So is it cash? Is it not diluting the share pool? Are you going up for another round of funding? Because that matters. And so you absolutely really have to partner with that board of directors and those executive comp committees in making that decision. When it comes to exec comp too, I think it's really cool because you have you have more levers to pull at the exec comp level than you do at your salaried, your hourly workforce. And so what drives executives to increase the valuation of your company? It could look like a lot of different things. It could be budget increases for tech stacks. It could be an equity refresh. It could be long-term cash incentive programs. There are a lot of additional compensation levers to pull at that exec comp level.
Awesome. We mentioned it's not worth losing someone over $2,500. However, what about internal equity and the additional costs to move everyone else accordingly?
Yeah, and since that was my comment, I'll take that one. Like I said, it's really tricky because you want to make sure that you're making the right decisions when you are making a decision about someone's compensation, right? And so when you're sort of thinking about the details, like for example, if I'm moving someone from an IC to a manager role, do they have management experience? How many years of experience? How do they stack up against the individuals who are at the same level, whether or not they're on the same team? So you really sometimes have to sort of dig in. $2,500, I think, is a relatively petty amount for a company my size. It may not be the same for a smaller company, but everyone doesn't have to make the same amount of money, and I think that's important to know. This is why you have the range, and there will be nuanced differences. It's the larger differences that really get you in trouble. So if you have a staff software engineer, and that staff software engineer is making $150 in the Bay Area, maybe they're making $125 in Texas, right? So there's some nuances there. Or you might have two in the Bay Area, and one is making $150 and one is making 155. And so if you can tell that story and you know why you made that decision and it's not pulling them way outside of those bands and those ranges, you're usually going to be okay. But we're not a government entity, right? Everyone doesn't make the exact same amount. And I think, most people recognize that.
Yeah. Last one, we got 30 seconds. How often do you revisit your comp data and employee salaries? Between inflation, talent wars, layoffs, things seem to be changing quickly.
Yeah, so we have data connections set up to refresh all of our compensation data on a daily or monthly level whenever survey data is released. So we have the visibility into the changing landscape, but we don't plan to update our compensation ranges during the year, and we do that as part of the annual process.
Awesome. There were so many great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but thank you so much to our three panelists. We really appreciate the time, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of Transform.